The words hit the room like a gunshot. Cyrus Covington stood at the far end of the long oak table in Elder Harlan Pruitt's meeting hall, his hat still on his head, his dark eyes burning with a fury that had been building for the better part of 3 hours. Dust from the trail still clung to his coat. His jaw was set like iron. And he looked directly at Harlan Pruitt, the most powerful man in Redemption Creek, Texas. A man who had never in his 61 years been spoken to the way he was about to be spoken to. "I have sat here and listened to every single one of you deliberate, delay, and dismiss," Cyrus said, his voice low and controlled, which made it more dangerous than shouting would have been. "You have spent the better part of this evening talking around what Gertrude Rhodes proposed, finding every reason in the world to reject it without once engaging with what she actually said. And I am telling you right now, as a man who has ridden through a dozen towns and sat at a dozen tables like this one, that she has more sense than everyone at this table." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a storm. Elder Pruitt's face went from red to a deep, dangerous purple. The 3 men seated beside him, Maxwell Holt the banker, Deputy Reardon, and Franklin Ames the land commissioner, exchanged glances of stunned disbelief. Nobody spoke to Harlan Pruitt that way. Nobody had ever spoken to Harlan Pruitt that way, least of all a drifter who had ridden into Redemption Creek not 5 weeks ago with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and a reputation that preceded him like smoke before a fire. Gertrude Rhodes sat at the other end of the table, very still, her hands folded in her lap. She was 30 years old, brown-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a dark green dress that was practical rather than pretty, though it suited her well. Her expression gave nothing away, which was a skill she had spent years perfecting. But her heart, the heart she kept locked behind logic and competence and the armor of a woman who had learned to survive without expecting rescue, that heart was doing something very strange and very inconvenient at this particular moment. It was racing. She had not asked Cyrus Covington to defend her. She had not expected it. She had not even looked at him when she stood up and presented her plan to the elders' council, because she had learned long ago that seeking approval in men's faces, while you spoke, only invited them to withhold it deliberately. But he had spoken anyway. And now she would have to figure out what to do with that. To understand how Gertrude Rhodes and Cyrus Covington ended up at that table, together, and against the world in a way neither of them had planned or wanted, you have to go back 5 weeks. To the afternoon, a stranger rode into Redemption Creek on a roan horse with a loose shoe and stopped in front of the general store. Redemption Creek in the spring of 1878 was a town of roughly 400 souls, perched on the edge of the Texas Hill Country, where the land rolled in pale limestone waves and the sky went on forever. It had a main street with a general store, a saloon called the Longhorn, a land office, a church that doubled as a school 3 days a week, a doctor's office that was frequently unoccupied because the doctor, an aging man named Elias Greer, spent most of his time at the Longhorn, and a hotel with 8 rooms and thin walls. It also had a problem that it had been trying to solve for 2 years without success. The creek that gave the town its name, a steady and reliable waterway that had originally made this patch of hill country worth settling, was being diverted. Upstream, on land that had been purchased through what Gertrude Rhodes privately believed were fraudulent means, a man named Colton Driscoll had built a dam. Not a big dam, not an engineering marvel, but enough of a dam to reduce the flow into Redemption Creek to a trickle in summer, which was precisely when the ranches and farms south of town needed it most. This was not a secret. Everyone in town knew about it. What they could not agree on was what to do about it. Elder Pruitt believed the answer was patience and legal process. He had written letters to the county seat. He had written letters to Austin. He had, as far as anyone could tell, been writing letters for 2 years and receiving polite acknowledgments in return, while the creek dried up a little more each summer. Gertrude Rhodes believed the answer was something else entirely, but we are getting ahead of ourselves." The afternoon Cyrus Covington rode into town. Gertrude was standing on the porch of the general store going over a delivery manifest with Thomas Wick, who owned the store and was the only employer in Redemption Creek willing to hire a woman in a position of actual responsibility. She handled his accounts, managed his inventory, corresponded with his suppliers in San Antonio and Austin, and generally kept his business from the chaos it would otherwise descend into, because Thomas Wick was a generous and sociable man who was terrible with numbers and worse with follow-through. She noticed the stranger because the horse had a bad shoe, and she noticed things like that. She noticed the way he sat in the saddle, easy and economical, the posture of someone who had spent a great deal of time on horseback and had made peace with it. She noticed that he was perhaps 34 or 35, dark-haired beneath a worn gray hat, with the kind of face that had been weathered by more than just sun. She did not stare. She returned to the manifest. Cyrus Covington swung down from the horse, led it to the water trough, and then looked up and down the main street of Redemption Creek with the particular expression of a man taking inventory of a place he is not sure he intends to stay. He caught Gertrude looking at him, which she had not meant to do a second time, and touched the brim of his hat. She gave a brief, businesslike nod and went back to the manifest. Thomas Wick, who had no such restraint, called out from the doorway where he had appeared to see what the commotion was. "Afternoon, stranger. Passing through or staying a spell?" Cyrus Covington crossed the street at a loose, unhurried walk. "Depends on whether your farrier is any good," he said. "My horse needs a new shoe and I need a meal and a bed." "Best farrier in the county is Eli Morse, 2 streets over," Thomas said cheerfully. "Hotel is there on the corner, and my wife does the best cornbread you ever tasted if you take your supper at the Longhorn before 8. "Obliged," Cyrus said. He glanced at Gertrude, who was still holding the manifest and not looking at him. "Ma'am." "Good afternoon," she said without looking up. That, as far as she was concerned, was going to be the entirety of their acquaintance. She was wrong. Cyrus Covington stayed in Redemption Creek because of the horse, and then because Marcus Holt, who ran the livestock operation adjacent to the hotel, offered him 3 weeks of work mending fences on the far pasture, which paid better than the road, and because the bed at the hotel was the first real mattress he had slept on in 4 months, and because there was something about this town that snagged at him in a way he could not immediately identify. He met Gertrude Rhodes again 4 days later, when he came into the general store to buy a new pair of work gloves, and found her at the counter in an argument with Maxwell Holt, the banker, who was a fat, pink-faced man with small eyes and the comfortable certainty of someone who has never had to doubt himself. "The figures are quite clear, Miss Rhodes," Maxwell Holt was saying with the patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. "The store's line of credit will need to be reviewed before any expansion of inventory is approved." "The figures are clear," Gertrude agreed in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and completely dangerous. "What's also clear is that the store has made every payment on schedule for the past 18 months, that the current inventory projection shows a 20% increase in demand based on the 2 new homestead families who arrived in February, and that the review you're proposing would take 6 weeks, which is precisely the window during which Thomas needs to place his spring orders if he wants them to arrive before summer. So what you are actually proposing is that he miss that window, lose the margin on those orders, and then present worse figures at the next review." Maxwell Holt opened and closed his mouth. "I have prepared a full accounting for your review," Gertrude continued, producing a folder of papers from under the counter with the smooth efficiency of someone who had anticipated this exact conversation. "You will find everything in order. I would appreciate a decision by Friday." Cyrus had been standing near the gloves, not moving, not making himself known. He watched Maxwell Holt take the folder, mutter something about getting back to her and leave. Then he watched Gertrude Rhodes take a slow, measured breath, square her shoulders, and look up to find a stranger watching her from beside the work gloves. She did not look embarrassed. That interested him. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. "Gloves," he said. "Size large." She pointed to the rack. He selected a pair, brought them to the counter, paid without comment. She counted out his change. "You're the man who's working Holt's fence line," she said. It was not a question. "I am. His east pasture runs along the upper creek bed. You'll see where the water level has dropped." She said it matter-of-factly, as if she was telling him something about the weather. "It's worth noting." He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because," she said, "I think the more people who see it with their own eyes, the harder it will be for the council to pretend it isn't happening." He pocketed his change. "Is that what they're doing?" "Some of them," she said. "The others know perfectly well it's happening and simply haven't decided it affects them enough to act." He turned the gloves over in his hands. "What would you do about it if it was your decision?" It was a strange question for a stranger to ask, and she recognized that. She also recognized that he was asking it as if her answer genuinely mattered to him, and that was rarer than the strangeness. "I would go around the legal channels that have been failing for 2 years," she said, "and go directly to the State Water Commission in Austin with a formal complaint, signed by every rancher and homesteader and business owner in this valley whose livelihood depends on that creek. I would make it impossible to ignore. And I would do it before the summer when the water drops again, and people are angry enough to do something stupid instead of something effective." Cyrus Covington looked at her with those dark, careful eyes. "That's a good plan." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, more like the idea of one, brief and warm and gone quickly. He put his hat back on and walked out. She watched him go and told herself very firmly that she had work to do. She did have work to do. She always had work to do, and she threw herself into it with the focused energy of a woman who understood that being indispensable was the closest thing to security that her world offered. Gertrude Rhodes had come to Redemption Creek 6 years ago with her father, Amos Rhodes, a schoolteacher who had believed in the promise of the frontier, with the earnest conviction of someone who had read more about it than he had lived in it. He had died of a fever in the winter of 1875, leaving Gertrude with a rented room, a small savings that would last 6 months if she was careful, and a set of skills, bookkeeping, correspondence, organization that were valuable everywhere and recognized almost nowhere, because they lived in a woman's hands. She had made it work. She had made it work through stubbornness and intelligence and the willingness to be underestimated, which she had turned from a disadvantage into a tool. People told things to the quiet woman who kept the books that they would never say in front of the men they were trying to impress. She had learned more about the secret workings of Redemption Creek through 3 years of ledger work than Elder Prout had learned in 20 years of committee meetings. She knew, for instance, that Colton Driscoll's land purchase upstream had been financed through a shell arrangement that ran through Maxwell Holt's bank. She had not been able to prove it conclusively, but she knew it, and she knew what it meant about why Holt was so resistant to any aggressive action regarding the water rights question. What she had not known, until she started drafting the petition for the State Water Commission, was how alone she would feel doing it. It was not that people disagreed with her. It was that they agreed with her and then found reasons not to sign. The ranchers worried about making enemies of Driscoll. The homesteaders worried about the cost of a legal fight. Thomas Wick was willing to sign but worried about his credit at the bank, which of course ran through Maxwell Holt. The women who might have signed were told by their husbands that it wasn't their place. And Elder Prout, when she brought the incomplete petition to him and explained her plan, listened politely and told her that he admired her initiative and that the matter was better handled through established channels. She walked home from that meeting and stood in her small rented room for a long time looking at the petition on her table. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily, and she did not cry then. She was the kind of woman who, when she hit a wall, started looking for the door. But that night, for the first time in a long time, she could not find one. She was still looking 3 days later when Cyrus Covington came back into the general store, not for anything he needed as far as she could tell, but because he had been riding the Holt fence line and had passed the point where the East Creek bed had gone to cracked mud, and it had stayed with him the way she had told him it would. "I saw the creek bed," he said. "Yes," she said, "that's not a small problem." "No," she said, "it isn't." He was quiet for a moment, leaning against the counter with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly. "How far along is your petition?" She looked at him steadily. "Not far enough." "How many signatures do you have?" 11, she said. "I need 30 to make the state commission take it seriously. 40 would be better." He was quiet again. She had noticed that about him, that he was not a man who filled silences out of discomfort. He sat in them and thought, and when he spoke it was because he had something to say. "I can talk to the men on Holt's crew," he said. "The ones who work the pasture near the creek bed. Most of them have families somewhere. They understand what water means." She studied him. "Why would you do that?" He met her eyes directly. "Because it's the right thing to do. You'll be in Redemption Creek for what, another week? 2. It doesn't affect you." Something moved behind his eyes, something complicated that she couldn't read yet. "Things that are wrong affect you whether they're happening to you directly or not," he said. "I learned that a while back." She did not ask him what he had learned it from. It was not the kind of question you asked a man who carried the particular weight that Cyrus Covington carried. But she filed it away. "All right," she said. "If you can get signatures from Holt's crew, I'd be grateful." He nodded. He put his hat back on, and then at the door he stopped. "Miss Rhodes." "Yes. Who are you taking the petition to when it's done?" "The Elders' Council first," she said, "as a formality, then to Austin." He turned around. "Why the council first if you know they're going to stall it?" "Because going around the council without at least presenting it to them would give Prout grounds to undermine it. He'd call it improper process, and that would be the conversation, not the water." Cyrus Covington looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought this through?" "I've thought about nothing else for 4 months, she said. He nodded slowly. There was something in his expression that was different from the polite interest most people showed when they praised her intelligence, something that felt more like recognition than condescension, as though he was not just acknowledging that she was capable but genuinely pleased about it. She told herself that the warmth she felt was entirely professional. Over the next 2 weeks, something shifted in Redemption Creek, quietly and then all at once. Cyrus worked the Holt fence line by day and spent his evenings talking to men at the Longhorn, not pressuring, not speechifying, just telling them what he had seen at the creek bed and asking them questions and listening to the answers with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. He had a gift for it. He made people feel heard, which was its own kind of persuasion, more effective than argument. He brought Gertrude 6 new signatures the first week, 8 the second week. Thomas Wick, emboldened by something Cyrus said to him that she was never entirely told, signed, and also convinced 2 of his suppliers who had dealings in the valley to add their names. She found herself watching for him in the mornings when she opened the store. She found herself leaving a small gap in her concentration around the hours when he was likely to stop by with updates. She found herself thinking about things she wanted to say to him, and then finding reasons why those things were not relevant or appropriate, before saying them anyway when he appeared. He always listened. That was the thing she was not prepared for. Most men listened to her long enough to formulate their objection. Cyrus Covington listened until she was finished, and then thought about what she had actually said, and the experience was so unusual that it consistently left her slightly off balance. They fell into a habit of meeting in the early evening, ostensibly to review the petition and plan the next day's approach, actually to talk, which was what they were both too honest with themselves not to acknowledge and too cautious to address directly. They sat at the small table in the back of the store after Thomas locked up for the night, with a lamp between them and the cooling air of a spring evening coming through the prop-back window. And they talked about the water rights strategy and the probable responses of the Elders' Council and the best way to present the case to Austin. And then the way it happens when two people are paying attention to each other. They talked about other things. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the third of 5 sons of a farming family, and that he had served in the war on the Union side at an age he had been too young to understand what he was choosing, and that what he had seen there had broken something in him that had taken a long time to start mending. He had been drifting for the better part of a decade, taking work where he found it, not because he had nowhere to go, but because he had not yet found a place that felt like the place. He learned that she had been engaged once briefly, to a man named Lawrence who had been charming and smart and ultimately unwilling to be with a woman who was smarter than him. He had ended the engagement with the excuse that she was too independent, which she had translated, with time and clarity, to mean that he had wanted a partner he could manage rather than one he had to actually reckon with. He said I made him feel unnecessary, she told Cyrus one evening, saying it lightly, as though it was just a fact and not something that had burrowed into her and stayed. Cyrus set down his coffee cup. Then he wasn't paying attention, he said. A woman knowing what she's doing doesn't make the right man unnecessary. It makes him want to be useful in a real way instead of just decorative. She looked at him across the lamp. The flame made shadows move across his face. That is a very specific thing to know, she said. I've had time to think, he said, and there was something dry and self-aware in it that made her laugh, which was not something she did easily or often. He looked at her when she laughed, with a directness that he didn't bother to conceal, and she felt it like a change in temperature. She looked away first. We should go through the council member responses one more time, she said. I want to be prepared for every objection. He picked up the papers without comment. She told herself she was grateful for his tact. The petition reached 37 signatures on a Tuesday afternoon, which Gertrude recorded in her neat handwriting with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has built something difficult out of insufficient materials. She held the document and thought of each name, each conversation, each small victory of persuasion. Cyrus was responsible for at least 14 of them. She went to tell him and found him at the farrier's where he was having his roan horse reshod again, standing with his arms crossed watching the work with the patient attention he brought to most things. 37, she said. He looked at her, and the smile that had never quite materialized in those first weeks finally arrived, full and warm and completely unguarded, and it rearranged something in her chest in a way she suspected was not temporary. That's enough, he said. It's enough, she agreed. They stood in the late afternoon light outside the farrier's, a few feet apart, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence had a different quality than it usually did. Heavier, fuller. Gertrude, he said, just her name, no title. I know, she said, before he could say whatever came next, because she did know, she had known for at least a week, and she was afraid of it in the specific way she was afraid of things that mattered too much. Not yet. Let's get through the council meeting first. He looked at her steadily for a moment. All right, he said. She nodded and walked away quickly before she could change her mind about the not yet. She spent 3 days preparing for the council presentation, drafting and redrafting her argument, anticipating objections, organizing the petition documents and the supporting evidence, including the water flow measurements she had taken herself at 3 points along the creek over 2 seasons, and the deed records she had obtained from the county office that she believed showed the irregularities in Driscoll's land purchase. The council met on the 3rd Friday of each month in Elder Pruitt's meeting hall, a long, low room with a portrait of President Hayes on the wall and a table that seated 8. Pruitt sat at the head. Maxwell Holt and Franklin Ames, the land commissioner, sat on his right. Deputy Reardon and 2 ranchers named Garth Stokes and Bill Prentice sat on his left. Thomas Wick, as a council member of lesser standing, sat at the far end. Gertrude had never been invited to present to the council. She had asked for this meeting in a formal written request, and Pruitt had granted it with the magnanimous condescension of a man who is confident the outcome is already decided. She had not told Cyrus to come. He came anyway, arriving before the meeting and sitting in the row of chairs against the wall that was technically the observer section, his hat on his knee, his face calm. She saw him when she came in and something steadied in her. She presented the petition and the evidence for 40 minutes, without notes after the first 5, because she knew it too well for notes. She laid out the water flow data, the timeline of the diversion, the economic impact on the ranches and farms downstream, the failure of the correspondence with Austin to produce any action, the legal framework under Texas water law that she believed supported a formal complaint to the state commission, and the 57 signatures, because 17 more had come in over the preceding 3 days when word got out that she was presenting to the council, that she now had in support. She was, she knew, the best prepared person in the room. She was also, she knew, the person in the room with the least formal power, and those two things did not balance each other out automatically. Power did not yield to competence. That was a lesson she had learned young and continued to learn in new ways. Elder Prout listened with his hands folded on the table. Then he said, "Thank you, Miss Rhodes. This is very thorough. The council will take it under advisement." Franklin Ames said he had concerns about the legal interpretation of the water rights statute. Maxwell Holt said that acting on the petition without further review could expose the town to liability. Deputy Reardon said that it was difficult to know what the situation at the dam actually was without an independent assessment. Garth Stokes looked at the ceiling. Bill Prentice looked at Holt. They were going to bury it. She could see it happening in real time, the polite burial of something she had spent 4 months building, sentence by careful sentence. Thomas Wick started to speak and Prout talked over him. And then Cyrus Covington stood up from the observer's chair. "I have a question," he said. Not loud, just clear. Prout looked at him with cold authority. "This is a council proceeding, Mr. Covington. Observers do not have the floor." "I am not speaking to the council," Cyrus said. "I'm speaking to the record, which I understand is kept." He looked at the clerk, a young man named Bates, who was indeed scribbling. "I would like it noted that every specific claim Miss Rhodes has made tonight has documentary support that is sitting on that table, that not a single council member has identified a factual error in her presentation, and that the objections raised have been procedural rather than substantive, which tells me more about the resistance to this petition than anything the council has said." "Mr. Covington, I will ask you to sit down or leave," Prout said. "I'll say one more thing," Cyrus said. He was not going to sit down. There was not a single molecule of him that was going to sit down. "I have ridden through a lot of towns, and I have sat at a lot of tables like this one. What I have seen tonight is a woman who has done the work, done it better than anyone in this room could have done it with evidence and planning, and the support of nearly every person whose livelihood actually depends on that creek. Bring that work to this table, and watch it be set aside by men whose first instinct is to protect a process rather than solve a problem." He looked directly at Harlan Prout across the length of the table, and he said it without flinching, without posturing, with the simple and absolute conviction of a man who has decided to tell the truth. "She has more sense than everyone at this table. I thought someone should say it plainly." The silence that followed was enormous. Gertrude's hands were very still in her lap. She was looking at the table in front of her, not because she was ashamed, but because she was managing something that was happening in her throat that she would not allow to become visible. Nobody in this room had ever said that. Nobody in any room had said it. She had been competent and capable and occasionally even praised, but praise from men like these always came in the form of surprise, as in, "She is quite good for a woman," or the diminishing qualifier, as in, "She is bright in her way." Not this. Not simply, "She is better than all of you." She kept her eyes on the table and breathed. Elder Prout rose to his full height. He was not a physically imposing man, but he had the presence of someone who had wielded authority for a long time. "Mr. Covington," he said, "you are not a resident of this town. You have no standing here and no investment in its affairs. Your opinion of this council's proceedings is not relevant to anything. My opinion of your proceedings isn't relevant, Cyrus agreed. The State Water Commission's opinion might be. Miss Rhodes, are you still planning to submit the petition to Austin? She looked up. Yes, she said, I am. Then this council's vote tonight doesn't matter much either way, he said. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. I appreciate your time. He walked to the door and opened it and stood there, not leaving, which she understood to be not quite an invitation and not quite a command, but something in between, a door held open by someone who would not presume to tell her whether to walk through it. She gathered her papers. She stood. She looked at Harlan Pruitt and at Maxwell Holt and at Franklin Ames, and she said with perfect composure, I will send the council a copy of the submission when it goes to Austin, as a courtesy. And she walked out. The night air outside was cool and clean and smelled of cedar. She walked down the 2 steps from the meeting hall and stopped on the packed dirt of the street because her legs needed a moment and she was not going to let them see her hurry. Cyrus came down behind her and stopped beside her. She stared at the empty street for a long moment. The Longhorn 2 blocks down was lit and loud. A dog was barking somewhere. The moon was up. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. It may make things harder. Pruitt won't forget it. I'm aware. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the street, not at her, giving her space that she hadn't asked for but that she appreciated. She studied the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the worn-in quality of him that she had come to find unexpectedly comfortable. I thought you were leaving next week, she said. Your work on the Holt property is done. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about staying a while longer, he said, if there's a reason to. There's the Water Commission process, she said. It will take months. Someone who knows the background could be useful if they require an in-person witness to the conditions. That's one reason, he said. And Marcus Holt mentioned he has worked through the summer, she said, if you're looking for employment. That's practical, he said. Also not quite what I meant. She turned back to the street. She was aware of the warmth of him beside her in the cool air, the proximity that had its own particular gravity at this point. Cyrus, she said. Gertrude, he said, and his voice when he said her name had a quality that she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. I am not an easy person to know, she said. I am told I am too direct and too certain and too unwilling to soften things for the sake of other people's comfort. I know, he said, I have noticed. I am telling you that as a warning. I understand, he paused. I have a dark past, he said, and it was not dramatic, just honest. Not criminal, but the war left marks that don't always sleep quietly. I am not a finished project. I never expected a finished project, she said. He finally looked at her, and she looked back. And the thing that had been building between them since the afternoon he first walked into the store, and she refused to look up from her manifest, was right there in the space between them, as obvious and inevitable as water finding its level. She stepped toward him, and he met her halfway, and he kissed her with a gentleness that surprised her, given the forcefulness of the man she had come to know. And then she kissed him back with the complete conviction she brought to everything. And it was nothing like the polite, cautious thing that kissing Lawrence had been. And she thought with the small, still analytical part of her brain that was never entirely off, that she probably should have expected that too. They stood in the street for a long moment, her hands against the lapels of his coat, his arms around her with the particular care of a man handling something he understands is not fragile, but matters anyway. I have work to do in the morning, she said against his shoulder. I know, he said. So do I, but neither of them moved for another minute, and the moon went on being there, and the dog stopped barking, and Redemption Creek was very quiet around them. The morning after the council meeting brought a new development that Gertrude had half anticipated but had hoped would wait. Maxwell Holt came to the store before opening and spoke to Thomas Wick privately. Gertrude, arriving for work, found Thomas in the back looking troubled. He's reviewing the credit line, Thomas said without preamble. Full audit, 60 days. She set down her bag. That's the retaliation. He says it's routine. Thomas rubbed his forehead. Gertrude, I don't want to make trouble for you, but if he calls the loan, I don't know that I can keep the store running through the summer. He's not going to call the loan, she said. The store is profitable and the payments are current. He'd have no basis. This is pressure, Thomas. He wants you to ask me to back down. Thomas looked at the floor. He was a good man and an honest one, but he had a wife and 2 children and a business he had built over 15 years. She understood what it cost him to be caught between them. I'm not asking you to back down, he said carefully. I'm just telling you what happened. I know, she said. She was already thinking. I'm going to respond to this in a way that protects you. Let me work on it. What she did was this. She spent the rest of the morning drafting a detailed letter to the county banking authority, citing the timing of the credit review relative to the council meeting and the water petition, characterizing it as potential financial coercion of a business owner in retaliation for civic participation, and requesting that any audit findings be independently verified. She wrote it carefully and precisely and without inflammatory language, which made it more dangerous than an angry complaint would have been. She sent it with the noon stage. Then she went to find Cyrus. He was working at the far end of Holt's South pasture, and she rode out on Thomas's bay mare, which was a somewhat formal approach to what she was about to tell him, but the walk would have taken too long. He saw her coming and stopped what he was doing and waited, which was very him. She told him about the credit review and the letter. He listened with his arms folded, looking at the middle distance the way he did when he was thinking carefully. Holt is worried, he said when she finished. He should be, she said, but so is Thomas. What do you need? She looked at him. Nothing specific right now. I wanted you to know because you're part of this and you should know the state of it. He looked at her steadily. There was something in it that she was still getting used to, the fact that he didn't try to fix everything immediately, that he understood that sometimes telling someone was its own necessary thing. All right, he said. What happens next? We wait for Austin, she said. The petition went out this morning, and we let Holt show his hand. He nodded. I'll be at the Longhorn tonight if you need to talk through anything. You should know, she said, that being seen talking to me is now somewhat politically complicated. He looked at her with something that might have been amusement. Is that your polite way of warning me off? No, she said. It's my honest way of telling you the cost. The cost, he said, is manageable. She rode back to town feeling, against all reasonable analysis of the situation, lighter than she had in months. The waiting was the hard part. She was not a woman suited to waiting, which was precisely why she used every moment of it. She organized the supporting materials for the Austin submission into a file that could be produced on request. She wrote a follow-up letter to the State Water Commission with additional water flow data she had collected. She compiled a secondary document connecting the timing of the dam construction to the change in Driscoll's land ownership records, the thread she had never been able to pull all the way through, but which was getting cleaner as she worked. Cyrus helped her, not with the documents, which were her domain, but with the other things. He had a conversation with Garth Stokes, the rancher on the council, that resulted in Stokes quietly telling Elder Prout he thought the petition deserved a fair review. He talked to 3 of the homesteaders who had been afraid to sign, and persuaded 2 of them to add their names. He did these things without telling her about them in advance, just brought her the results, and she understood that he was not seeking credit, just being useful. One evening, sitting at the back table of the store in the lamplight, she looked up from the papers and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite categorize, and she said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "I'm thinking." "What about?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been in a lot of places where I knew I was going to leave. This is the first one in a long time where I've been thinking about what it would mean to stay for good." She put down her pen. This was the conversation they had been walking around for 3 weeks, and they had arrived at it in the lamplight over a water rights petition, which was so perfectly characteristic of both of them that she almost laughed. "I told you I wasn't an easy person," she said. "You did," he said. "I told you I wasn't a finished project." "I remember." "I am also," he said carefully. The kind of man who, when he decides something, decides it completely. So I need to know if you want me to be deciding this or not. Because if you're going to tell me eventually that it's not what you want, I would rather you tell me now. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Lawrence and the broken engagement, and the years of building something real and solid out of independence because nothing else had held. She thought about what it had cost her to become capable of being alone, and what it would cost her, differently, to choose otherwise. I want you to decide it, she said. I'm not telling you to leave. Something moved across his face that was quieter and more certain than happiness, something more like the arrival of something that had been on its way for a while. All right, he said. All right, she said. She picked up her pen again. Now help me with this evaporation calculation, because my numbers aren't matching the downstream gauges and it's bothering me. He pulled his chair around to her side of the table, and they worked together until the lamp burned low. The response from the State Water Commission came 6 weeks later in a thick envelope addressed to Miss Gertrude Rhodes at the Redemption Creek General Store. She did not open it alone. She held it until Cyrus came in that evening, and she looked at it sitting on the counter between them, and then she opened it. The commission had accepted the complaint. A state inspector would be sent within 30 days to assess the water diversion at the dam. The deed records regarding the upstream land purchase would be reviewed by the Attorney General's office. She read it twice. Then she set it down. Cyrus read it. He looked up at her. You did it, he said. We did it, she said. Most of those signatures are yours. The argument is yours, he said. The strategy is yours. The evidence is yours. The execution is yours. He said it simply as a statement of fact. I helped carry some things. You built it. She had spent 30 years building things that other people took credit for, and the particular quality of being accurately seen for what she had made was so sharp and unexpected that she had to look away for a moment. I'm going to tell Thomas, she said. He'll be pleased, Cyrus said. And then I think you should tell Elder Prout. She looked back at him. Why, he'll hear about it. Because you giving him the information directly in writing before he hears it elsewhere is the proper process, Cyrus said, with a hint of something wry at the edge of his mouth. And you're a woman who believes in proper process when it works in your favor. She narrowed her eyes at him. He was not entirely wrong. You are occasionally irritating, she said. I know, he said. You mentioned it last week. She wrote the letter to Prout that evening, formal and correct, informing him of the commission's acceptance of the complaint and the upcoming inspection. She was gracious in a way that was entirely genuine, because she was not interested in humiliating anyone, only in solving the problem. Prout did not respond directly. But 2 days later, Garth Stokes stopped by the store and told her that Prout had said, privately, that the petition had been handled with considerable professionalism. Coming from Prout, Gertrude understood. That was roughly equivalent to a public apology. Maxwell Holt's credit review of the store was completed and found nothing irregular, which she had always known it would, and the matter was closed. She did not mention to anyone the letter she had sent to the county banking authority, but she kept a copy of it, because she believed in documentation. The state inspector arrived on a Tuesday in late July, a dry and windless day when the creek south of town was running at about a third of its normal rate for the season. His name was Caldwell, a thin, methodical man from Austin who wore city clothes that were immediately dusty and looked at everything with the careful impartiality of someone who has learned to be immune to pressure. Gertrude showed him the water flow measurements. Cyrus took him out to the dam site, riding alongside and pointing out the engineering of the diversion without editorial. Inspector Caldwell took notes and photographs and measurements for 2 days and then left, thanking them briefly and promising a report within 60 days. The report, when it came, found the diversion in violation of Texas water statutes. Colton Driscoll was ordered to remove or modify the dam to restore minimum flow levels downstream. The deed records review resulted in a separate inquiry that eventually implicated Maxwell Holt in a land speculation scheme that had been running for 3 years. using fraudulent assessments to undervalue properties before Driscoll purchased them at depressed prices. Holt resigned from the council in October, citing personal business concerns. He was gone from Redemption Creek before the end of the year. None of that happened quickly, and the waiting and working through of it took the rest of the summer and into the fall. But the day the inspector's report arrived and the order against Driscoll was posted at the land office, something changed in Redemption Creek. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but with the slow, certain shift of a thing being set right. Gertrude was in the store when 3 ranchers she had never particularly gotten on with came in separately across the course of that afternoon, and each of them, in their way, acknowledged what she had done. Garth Stokes said, "I should have signed that petition from the start." Bill Prentice said nothing, but bought an extra 20-pound bag of flour and left what she calculated was an exactly 40% overpriced payment. The third, a man named Combe Webb who had refused to speak to her directly for 3 years following a dispute over a surveying line that she had correctly identified as his error, stopped in the doorway on his way out and said, "You done good, Miss Rhodes," and then left before she could respond. She stood in the middle of the store for a moment after the door closed. Thomas came out from the back room where he had been moving inventory. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "I'm just noting the moment." He smiled at her, broad and genuine. "You should let yourself enjoy it." "I am," she said. "This is what enjoying it looks like." He laughed, which was fair. She found Cyrus at the hotel that evening. He had a room on the upper floor with a window that faced west, and she had been there twice before to talk through strategy at times when the store wasn't available, and both times she had been very proper and businesslike about it, which she thought spoke well of her self-discipline. This time she knocked on the door, and when he opened it and looked at her, she said, "The order came through." He looked at her for a moment, reading her face the way he had learned to. "Tell me." She told him. He listened. And then he did something she had not expected. He pulled her into a hug, not a romantic gesture, just a genuine one, the hug of someone who has been fighting alongside you and is relieved that the fight went the right way. She stood in it and breathed. "You should be proud," he said. "I am," she said into his shoulder. "I am very proud." He pulled back and looked at her. "Good," he said. "You should be." She stepped back and straightened her dress. The room was lit by the late evening light coming through the west window, warm and amber. She looked at him standing there, this man she had watched become essential to her over the course of a summer, and she thought about the not yet she had said to him outside the farrier's all those months ago, and she thought it was a long time since she had had a reason to keep saying it. "Cyrus," she said. "Gertrude," he said. "I have some things I would like to say to you," she said. "I'm listening," he said. He sat down in the chair by the window and gave her his full attention, and she stood in the middle of the room and looked at him. "I am not good at wanting things," she began. "Or rather, I am good at it and very bad at saying that I want them, because wanting things means they can be taken away, and I have found it more efficient to simply need them less." She paused. "I say that so you understand that what I'm about to tell you does not come easily." He watched her. He did not rush her. "I want you to stay," she said. "Not for the Water Commission and not for the petition and not as a practical matter. I want you to stay because I have been happier this summer than I have been in years, and most of the specific reasons I can identify for that are you. And because when I imagined the fall and winter without you here, I felt something that I can only describe as the wrong direction, and I am very rarely uncertain about direction." She took a breath. "That is what I wanted to say." Cyrus Covington stood up from the chair. He crossed the room in 2 steps, and he took her face in his hands, and he looked at her with an expression that was entirely open and unguarded in a way she had not seen on him before. "I decided to stay months ago," he said. "I was waiting for you to be ready to let me." "I didn't know I wasn't ready," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't going to rush you." She put her hands over his and leaned into the warmth of them. "I am also," she said carefully, "the kind of woman who, when she decides something, decides it completely." He smiled. This time it was full and it stayed. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you decide things all summer." She kissed him, deliberately and completely, and he kissed her back, and the amber evening light came through the window and made the room warm, and Redemption Creek went about its business outside. They were formally engaged by the first week of October. She told Thomas first, who expressed delight and immediately asked if Cyrus was going to need a job in town because he had been thinking about expanding the store if the credit situation was properly resolved, which it now was. She told Elder Prout by letter, which was formal and perhaps slightly pointed. She told no one else directly. In Redemption Creek in 1878, news of that kind spread efficiently without assistance. The response from the town was, by and large, warm. Most people liked Cyrus, who had spent the summer being useful and honest and buying rounds at the Longhorn without making it a performance. Many people had come, gradually and with some resistance, to respect Gertrude, which was different from liking but in some ways more durable. The combination of them together was generally regarded as a match made by logic rather than luck, which the people who said it meant as a compliment, and which Gertrude and Cyrus both understood was the highest compliment Redemption Creek knew how to give. There was one conversation that was harder. Cyrus sat with Gertrude on the porch of the store one evening in early October, the air already holding the first hint of the coming cold, and he told her more about the war, things he had not told her before, the specific memories that did not sleep quietly. He told her about the farm he had come home to that was not the same farm, because the family in it was not the same family, not because of death, but because of the particular damage that happens to people who wait for someone to come back and have to hold everything together while they wait, and how he had felt like a stranger in the place that was supposed to be home, and had left rather than become a burden. She listened without interrupting, which cost her nothing because she was a woman who understood the value of uninterrupted honesty. When he finished, she said, "You are not a burden. I want you to hear me say that clearly. You are someone who has earned the right to take up space." He looked at her with the expression he got when she said something that went past his defenses. "That's a very specific thing to know," he said, which was what she had said to him that first evening. She looked at him steadily. "I've had time to think," she said. He laughed, which was not something he did easily or often, and it was entirely worth it. They were married in the Redemption Creek Church on a Saturday in November, in a ceremony that was simple and brief because neither of them had any patience for ceremony, but which was attended by most of the town, which filled the small church past comfortable capacity so that people stood along the walls and in the doorway. Thomas Wick cried openly and without embarrassment. Elder Prout attended and was correct and formal, which from Prout was a form of blessing. The reception was at the Longhorn, which stayed closed to its usual trade for the afternoon, and was decorated by Thomas's wife with dried flowers and cedar branches that made the whole saloon smell like the hill country in November. Gertrude wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself, with white lace at the collar that had belonged to her mother. Cyrus wore his best coat, which she had noticed him having cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and he stood beside her at the front of the room with the particular stillness of a man who has found the place he was looking for and is making very sure he knows it. Garth Stokes made a toast that mentioned the water petition, which caused some mixed expressions among the guests but which Gertrude privately thought was exactly right, because the water petition was as much a part of how they had come to this day as anything else. She made a toast herself, brief and precise, which was not traditional but was entirely her. She said, "I spent a long time believing that the best thing I could build in this town was a solid case. I am grateful to have been wrong about what the best thing was." There was a moment of surprised quiet and then warm applause, and Cyrus looked at her with an expression that made her chest hurt in the best possible way. They set up in a small house on the south side of town, 2 streets over from the main road, that had been vacant since the previous occupants moved east in the spring. It needed work. The roof had a corner that Cyrus repaired on the second day. The kitchen had a broken stove pipe that he fixed on the third. The yard was overgrown with cedar scrub that he cleared over 2 weekends with the patient efficiency he brought to physical tasks. Gertrude negotiated the lease, arranged the furniture, and turned 2 crates and a plank into a bookshelf that she covered with the books she had been keeping in her rented room for 6 years. She continued working for Thomas. There was never any serious question of her stopping. She was what made the business run, and they both knew it. And Cyrus understood this not only intellectually but genuinely, the way he understood most things about her, not as an adaptation he was making, but as a fact he was glad was true. He took permanent work managing the Holt livestock operation, which Marcus Holt offered him with relief because he had been short a reliable foreman since the previous one had gone north. It was steady work and honest work, and it suited him. And the Holt property being adjacent to the East Creek bed meant he watched the water levels every week, which was a thing neither of them ever quite stopped doing. The creek, by the following summer, was running at full levels again. The dam had been modified per the commission's order, and the flow downstream had returned to what the old-timers said it had been before Driscoll's purchase. The ranches south of town had a good summer, and the homestead families who had been struggling most during the drought years began to stabilize. 2 families who had been planning to leave stayed. Gertrude watched this happen with the particular satisfaction of a person seeing the long consequence of a right decision. It was not showy or dramatic. It was water in a creek bed and cattle at a full trough and corn growing in a field that had been too dry the previous 2 years. But it was real, and it was the thing she had worked for, and it was enough. Colton Driscoll, whose land purchase was eventually found to have been executed through the fraudulent scheme that Gertrude had always suspected, lost title to the upstream property through the Attorney General's process that ran into the following spring. He left the county quietly. Nobody in Redemption Creek ever heard from him again. Maxwell Holt's banking irregularities resulted in a formal investigation that wound through the county and state systems for over a year. He settled the matter privately before it reached a public trial, paying significant restitution to the county and surrendering his banking license. Gertrude, who had been quietly keeping documentation of her original suspicions about his involvement in the scheme, provided it to the investigator when asked, without editorializing. She kept Thomas's books through all of it, and added to her clients a widowed rancher named Clara Tibbs who needed help with her property accounts, and then a second rancher, and then the new doctor who replaced old Elias Greer when Greer finally retired from both medicine and the Longhorn simultaneously. Life in Redemption Creek organized itself around the steady rhythms of seasons and work, and the small accumulating texture of days. She and Cyrus fell into a partnership so thorough that it encompassed everything: the house and the work, and the evenings at the table with the lamp, and the mornings when the coffee was ready before either of them spoke, and that was enough. He had nights, sometimes, when the war came back to him, when he woke in the darkness with his jaw tight and his hands fisted in the sheets. She had learned what helped and what didn't, and what helped was not words but presence, the simple fact of her beside him, which was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. He told her once, in the particular honesty of 3 in the morning, that having a person who knows the shape of your worst hours and stays anyway is the specific thing that makes a home. She told him that was true in both directions. She was not uncomplicated either. She had the particular anxiety of a woman who has spent years being responsible for everything, which did not evaporate with marriage and love. There were times when she took on too much and drove herself into exhaustion. There were times when she made decisions without telling him, not from secrecy, but from the deep-seated habit of carrying things alone. He was patient with this, and honest when it was a problem, and she worked at it because working at the things that mattered was what she did. In the spring of 1880, their first child was born, a boy. They named him Amos for her father, with the middle name of Eli after the farrier who had given Cyrus the first conversation he'd had in Redemption Creek that had felt easy and honest. Amos Rhodes Covington arrived on a Tuesday in March and was received with the full bewildered delight that parents are ambushed by regardless of how practically they have approached the matter. Cyrus held him in the first hour with an expression of such naked wonder that Gertrude, watching from the bed where she was exhausted and relieved and entirely overwhelmed, said, "You look like you can't believe he's real." "I can't," Cyrus said, not taking his eyes off the baby. "I've been looking at difficult things clearly for a long time. This is the first time I've looked at something good and couldn't see the limit of it." She looked at her husband and her son and felt something she didn't have an exact word for. Not happiness exactly, though it was that, but more like the completion of a shape she hadn't known was incomplete. Amos was a vigorous and demanding infant who grew into a determined toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's absolute certainty that his opinion was correct. He had no patience for ambiguity and considerable capacity for enthusiasm, which he expressed at a volume that carried through the walls of the house and into the yard and occasionally down the street. Thomas Wick became, effectively, his honorary uncle, spending Sunday afternoons at the house and teaching him things of questionable practical value that he retained with infallible accuracy. Garth Stokes' wife, a capable woman named Nora who had initially kept a careful distance from Gertrude and had eventually decided to reverse that, became a genuine friend, the kind who came on difficult days and didn't require conversation. Elder Prout retired from the council in the fall of 1880, citing his age, which was real, and his health, which was less pressing than he made it sound, and possibly a desire to stop being in the vicinity of things he had been wrong about, which Gertrude privately suspected was the most honest reason. His replacement, a younger man named Graves who had settled in Redemption Creek 3 years earlier with his family, was considerably less entrenched and considerably more willing to listen to the people who actually knew what they were talking about. At the first council meeting under Graves's chairmanship, Gertrude was formally appointed as the town's financial auditor, a position that had not existed before, and that she had technically invented by presenting Graves with a proposal for it in her first week. She did this without asking Cyrus first, and when she told him about it that evening he looked at her across the dinner table and said, "When did you submit that?" "Tuesday," she said. "While you were at the south pasture, and you didn't mention it. I wanted to see if he'd accept it first," she said. "There seemed no point in discussing it if he rejected it." "Gertrude," he said. "What?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm not criticizing you. I'm telling you that I want to know things like this, not because I need to approve them, but because they matter to you and I want to know the things that matter to you." She looked at the table for a moment, running the conversation through her internal review. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she also knew that the habit he was asking her to change had been her primary survival mechanism for most of her adult life. "I'm working on it," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll still be asking." "I know," she said. "I'm glad you do." Amos fell asleep in his chair at the end of the table at this point, face tipped sideways against his arm, which dissolved the remaining weight of the conversation into something lighter. Cyrus carried him to bed and she cleaned up the kitchen and they sat on the front porch in the evening air, the way they had come to do most nights, talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and the street was quiet and the stars were out in the particular abundance that the hill country produced in a clear September sky. "I keep thinking about the creek," she said. "What about it?" "I keep thinking that if the dam had been built 10 years earlier before I came here, the town might not have survived long enough for me to find it, and then none of this would have existed." He was quiet for a moment. "Or you would have been somewhere else doing something else," he said, "and so would I, and we would never have known what we missed." "That's a terrible thought," she said. "I know," he said, "so I mostly don't think it." She looked up at the stars. "I'm very glad the dam was built when it was," she said, which was possibly the strangest thing she had ever said, but he understood it exactly, and pressed a kiss to her temple in the particular way he had that was not dramatic or elaborate, but that she felt completely. The second child came in the winter of 1882, a girl they named Frances, which was Cyrus's mother's name. Frances arrived with the same insistence as her brother, but expressed it differently. Being a baby of notable opinions about sleep schedules and the temperature of her food, and a particularly penetrating gaze that made visitors feel they were being assessed. "She looks at people the way you do," Cyrus told Gertrude on Frances's third day of life, "like she's deciding whether they've earned her attention yet." "That is a very fair observation," Gertrude said. "It's a compliment," he said. "I know," she said. "I received it as one." Amos was 2.5 when Frances arrived, and after an initial period of suspicious evaluation, he became her devoted protector, which expressed itself mostly through standing very close to her crib with his arms crossed and staring at anyone who came near in a way that was so precisely his mother's expression on his father's face that it made both parents laugh every single time. Redemption Creek changed in the way that frontier towns change in the years after they stop simply surviving and begin to build. A second church was established, which caused the expected denominational debate that resolved without anyone being injured. A school that met 5 days a week replaced the 3-day arrangement, and Gertrude's name was among the most prominent on the committee that pushed for it, partly for the obvious reason, and partly because she had been teaching Amos to read since he was 2 years old and had opinions about educational standards that she wished to see implemented broadly. The Longhorn changed ownership, which was not a loss. The hotel expanded by 4 rooms. A doctor named Reese, younger than old Greer and possessed of actual current medical knowledge, set up a proper practice with an office that was clean and organized in a way that Gertrude quietly had a role in arranging, because she could not resist an organizational problem. Cyrus was offered, in the summer of 1883, a partnership in the Holt livestock operation, which had grown significantly under his management. Marcus Holt, who had more children than he had desire to run a cattle operation, and had been increasingly content to let Cyrus run it, made the offer with the slightly embarrassed generosity of a man who knows he has been getting more than he has been paying for. Cyrus came home and told her that evening. They were sitting at the kitchen table, Amos in bed, Frances in the corner of the room in the cradle, doing the burbling commentary that meant she was thinking about sleeping but hadn't committed to it. "What do you want to do?" Gertrude asked. "I want to know what you think first," he said. She looked at him. He met her eyes, and there was the particular quality he brought to these conversations, the quality of actually asking, of wanting to know, that she had been experiencing for 5 years and had not yet stopped finding remarkable. She thought about it properly. "A partnership means investment," she said, "which means capital outlay. Which means we need to look at the terms carefully and make sure the equity structure is appropriate for what you've actually contributed, which is considerable and which Marcus knows it." She paused. "It also means Holt can't simply reduce your role without consequence, which is a different kind of security than a foreman position. And it means that what you build from here accumulates to you and to us and eventually to Amos and Frances." She looked at Frances, who had settled. "I think you should take it, but negotiate the terms before you say yes and have someone look over the agreement before you sign." "I was thinking you could look over the agreement," he said. "Obviously," she said. "I'm telling you to have me do that before you sign." He smiled at her. "Agreed," he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "What would I do without you?" "You would," she said precisely, "have a much more significant problem with the water rights petition. You would have signed an unfavorable fence contract with Holt in your first month, and you would have overpaid for your saddle repair in April." He laughed. "That's 3 things in 5 years." "Those are the 3 I know about," she said, squeezing his hand. He turned his hand over and held hers properly, his thumb running across the inside of her wrist the way he did, and she felt it the same way she always had, which was the same as saying, immediately and completely. The partnership was negotiated and finalized in September of 1883 on terms that Gertrude considered favorable, which meant they were terms that accurately reflected Cyrus's actual contribution and included a provision for expanding the operation's water access along the East Creek bed, which remained, and would always remain, a particular matter of interest to both of them. Frances, who had her mother's eyes and her father's easy way with animals, turned one in the winter of 1883 and stood up and walked across the kitchen floor on a cold February morning, while her brother watched with the deep and personal pride of a sibling who knows this is somehow his achievement. Life was full and real and demanding, and also, in the specific daily texture of it, very good. One evening in the spring of 1884, with both children in bed and the house quiet, Gertrude sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going over the quarterly accounts for the town audit, a task she found genuinely satisfying in the way of work that is both useful and intellectually interesting. Cyrus was at the table too, reading, which was something he had come to do more of in the years of settled life, building a small library of histories and engineering manuals, and occasionally novels, which he never admitted to finishing as quickly as he did. She looked up from the accounts and looked at him across the lamp. He was absorbed in his book. The house smelled of the cedar wood he had split that morning, and of the bread she had baked, and of the particular combination that was just their house, that she couldn't have described to anyone else but recognized as belonging. He looked up, sensing her gaze. "Problem with the accounts?" "No," she said. "What then?" She thought about how to say it. She had gotten better over the years at saying things when they occurred to her rather than carrying them alone until they had been reviewed and revised into something safer. She was still not naturally given to it, but she had practiced because the practice mattered. "I was thinking about the day you walked into the store," she said, "with the worn-out gloves and the horse with the bad shoe." He smiled. "You didn't look up from your manifest." "I looked up twice," she said. "I just made sure you didn't see the second time." He set down his book. "Is that so?" "You were annoyingly noticeable," she said. "It was inconvenient. I had work to do." "You've always had work to do," he said. "Yes," she said, "and you kept showing up in the middle of it anyway." He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his particular form of deep affection, the one that wasn't performed or demonstrative but simply present in the line of his face. "I'm glad I showed up," he said. "So am I," she said. She held his gaze. "I am very glad you showed up, Cyrus." He stood up and came around the table, and she stood to meet him. And he held her in the middle of the kitchen, with both arms in the comfortable and complete way of people who have been holding each other long enough to know exactly how it fits. "I'm not going anywhere," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "That is not something I worry about anymore." He pressed a kiss to her temple, her cheek, the corner of her mouth, and she turned into it and kissed him back with the ease of practice and the warmth of something that had been true for a long time and showed no sign of diminishing. The lamp burned. The cedar cracked in the kitchen stove. Outside, Redemption Creek settled into the quiet hours between sunset and midnight, the creek running at full level along the east bed, the stars doing their reliable thing above the hill country, the town going about the ordinary and extraordinary business of being alive. Gertrude stood in her kitchen in the arms of the man she had chosen, in the house they had built, in the town she had fought for, and thought, with the clear and measured honesty that was the most herself thing about her, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the world had arranged it for her, not because something outside of herself had decided it, but because she had decided it, through work and stubbornness and the willingness to let one particular drifter with a horse in need of a new shoe show her something she hadn't known she was missing. Which was the person who looked at her and saw what was actually there, and stayed anyway, and thought the world of it. Amos had a bad dream 3 nights later, the way children do, and padded into their room at 2 in the morning and climbed into the middle of the bed with the unconscious certainty of someone who knows he is welcome there. He fell asleep between them almost immediately, a warm and solid presence. Francis, 2 rooms over, slept through without interruption. Gertrude lay in the dark listening to her son breathe, her husband's arm across both of them, and felt the world contained in the radius of this room and found it, against all her practical instincts, entirely enough. More than enough. Cyrus was awake too. She knew from his breathing. "You're awake," she said quietly. "Yes." "Good dreams or difficult ones?" A pause. "Good ones," he said. "Actually good for once." She found his hand in the dark and held it. He pressed hers. "Tell me one of them," she said. He thought about it. "We were at the creek," he said quietly. "All 4 of us. It was summer. The water was high. Amos was trying to catch something, I don't know what, maybe a fish. Frances was sitting in the shallows making very serious decisions about the rocks she was picking up. You were reading something and also watching all of us, which you do even when you think you're just reading." She smiled in the dark. "That sounds accurate." "It does," he said. "It was perfectly ordinary, and it was the best thing I've ever seen." She was quiet for a moment, listening to Amos breathe, feeling the weight of the life they had made, the water running at full in the creek 2 streets over, the spring coming on, the world going about its business without requiring anything particular of them for one dark and quiet hour. "Cyrus," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said important things, directly and completely, without ornament. "I love you," he said back the same way, and it was the truest thing either of them had said, and they had both said a lot of true things. The house was quiet. The night was long. And Redemption Creek held them as it held everyone who had decided to make something real in the difficult and beautiful country of the frontier, ordinary people building ordinary lives in extraordinary times, and doing it, when they were lucky, together. In the fall of that year, Gertrude discovered she was expecting a 3rd child, which she calculated would arrive in late April of 1885. She told Cyrus at breakfast on a Wednesday, setting the information before him with the same directness she brought to everything, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her and then at Amos, who was eating with the focused industriousness of a small boy who has opinions about his porridge, and then at Frances in her chair, who was examining her spoon with great philosophical attention. "That is very good news," he said. "I agree," she said. "The timing is manageable. The spring is a reasonable season for it." He looked at her across the table. "Gertrude." "Yes." "Stop calculating for one moment." She stopped. He was smiling at her, the full smile that had arrived on the day the petition reached 37 signatures and had never fully gone away since. "I am very happy," he said. "Are you?" She let herself simply answer it. "Yes," she said, "I am very happy." Frances banged her spoon on the tray of her chair and said something emphatic in the language that she was assembling, word by word, with great personal authority. Amos explained to her, incorrectly but confidently, what she had been saying. Cyrus caught Gertrude's eye across the table, and the shared amusement of it was its own language, specific to them, built over 5 years. The 3rd child was indeed born in late April of 1885. A boy again, which pleased Amos enormously. They named him Solomon, which was Cyrus's grandfather's name, and he arrived with red gold hair that neither parent could account for and lungs that could be heard clearly from the front porch. Amos stood beside the bed where Gertrude held the new baby and looked at him with the critical appraisal of a 5-year-old establishing hierarchy. "He's very loud," he said. "He is," Gertrude agreed. "Is he going to do that a lot?" "For a while," she said. Amos considered this. "I was probably loud too," he said, which was generous and also, she knew, something Cyrus had told him in advance to say. She looked up at Cyrus, standing in the doorway with Frances on his hip, and he looked back at her, and between them was everything that didn't need to be said. Redemption Creek in the spring of 1885 was not the town it had been in 1878. It was larger and more settled, with streets that had taken on the particular permanence of places that intend to last. The creek ran steady. The school had a permanent building now, with 3 teachers and a library of 40 books, several of which Gertrude had donated. The council met in a proper hall. The annual cattle drive north brought money into the community that made the winters easier. Garth Stokes had become a genuine ally and an occasional friend. In the specific frontier sense of friend, that means someone who will show up with tools when your fence comes down, and who you will do the same for. His wife Nora and Gertrude had developed the kind of friendship that sustains itself through disagreement and honesty, and the knowledge that the other person is not going anywhere. Thomas Wick expanded the store twice, which Gertrude managed both times, and the expanded credit line with the new bank, which had replaced Holt's operation, was handled cleanly and without incident. Thomas's eldest daughter came to work in the store at 15 and showed an aptitude for the accounts that Gertrude began quietly cultivating, the way Gertrude wished someone had done for her. Solomon grew, and Amos grew, and Francis grew, and the house grew louder and more full and more itself. Cyrus put up a proper fence around the yard in the summer of 1885 and planted a kitchen garden that was partly his idea and partly Gertrude's, and was tended by both, which was as good a metaphor as anything for what they had built. On a Thursday evening in August of 1885, Gertrude sat on the front porch of her house at the end of a long day, watching Cyrus in the yard with all 3 children. He was attempting to explain something to Amos, who disagreed with it. Francis was climbing the fence with the methodical certainty of someone who does not believe fences are meant for her. Solomon was sitting in the dirt regarding a beetle with profound interest. She watched her family in the late afternoon light. She thought about a woman standing in a small rented room 5 years earlier, looking at a petition on a table and unable to find the door. She thought about a man riding into town on a horse with a bad shoe, looking at the main street as if taking inventory of a place he was not sure he intended to stay. She thought about a long table and a lamp and the growing pile of signatures, and the meeting hall and the silence after certain words were spoken, and the night outside it with the moon and the dog and the cedar air. She thought about all the moments that had been, one after another, the long chain of choices that had brought her here. The beetle that Solomon was watching flew away. He looked at the space where it had been with an expression of philosophical acceptance that was very his father's. Francis reached the top of the fence and balanced there briefly with her arms out, triumphant. Cyrus spotted her at the same moment Gertrude did and started toward her calmly, because with Francis calm was always the correct approach. Amos was still talking. Gertrude looked at all of it, the whole ordinary, extraordinary scene, and felt the particular gratitude that doesn't announce itself, that simply settles into you like water into ground, deep and steady and permanent. She had built this. Not alone, not without help, not without the man in the yard who had shown up and stayed and been completely, reliably himself through all of it. But she had chosen it. She had let it in. And that, she thought, with the clear and honest certainty that was the most characteristic thing about her, was the best thing she had ever done. Cyrus caught Francis, who protested briefly and then accepted being set on the ground with the grace of someone who has already won the significant battle. He looked up and met Gertrude's eyes across the yard, and something passed between them that was entirely silent and entirely complete. She raised her hand, a small gesture. He raised his back. And the evening went on, ordinary and good, in the town by the creek in the hill country of Texas, where the water ran full and the sky went on forever, and 2 people who had found each other against all reasonable expectation were, without any further qualification required, exactly where they belonged.